Welcome to a session on building capacity for clinical innovation and insights from our DHVL fellows. So I'll give a brief introduction to myself and then hand over to Dervla and Sean, our current clinical fellows. So I'm Dr. Claire Higgs-McCallum. I'm the portfolio manager at the Digital Health Validation Lab. Before this, I've had an academic background in digital health evaluation methods and lecturer, and then moved into industry for a bit actually at venture capital. So I was working as a research and impact manager, helping startups with evidence generation and product development before then coming here. So as a portfolio manager, I'm responsible for all of our evaluation projects and overseeing them, progressing them through our pipeline from very early stage conceptualization through to contracting and delivery and completion. So yes, glad to be joined by two of our current clinical innovation fellows today, who you'll be hearing the most from. If I start with Dervla, if you can give a quick intro.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Dervla. I'm a current FY4 working in NHS GGC. I did my foundation training in Glasgow and I've got an interest in general medicine across a wide variety of specialties, and I've been working with the DHVL for the last year.
Thanks. And Sean?
Hello, my name is Sean Duncan. I'm a clinical research fellow here at the DHVL. I had started here in 2023 after finishing internal medical training. And before that, I'd spent a couple of years in New Zealand and done my foundation programme in the northeast of England.
Fab, thanks. So format of today is there'll be some presentations from Dervla and Sean. Before then, I will ask a few questions. And then right at the end, we'll have Q&A from all of you online. So there's, I think someone's flagged that the Q&A isn't working at the moment. So if you could put them in the chat, or have I got it the other way around? Yeah, the chat is closed, so use the Q&A function, please, if you've got your questions. And if you can drop them in throughout the session, and then we'll answer them, and we're looking forward to seeing those towards the end. So Dervla is going to kick off telling us what a CIF actually is, some of the projects that we're involved in, both Dervla and Sean, and what comes next after being a CIF at the DHVL. And then we'll move into more of a chat and some questions for me on the experience of being a fellow, the more human experience part. And then, moving on to Q&A. So Dervla, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Claire. So yeah, I think the really key question here is, what is a clinical innovation fellow? I get asked this all the time, Sean, I'm sure you do as well. And to me, the job really has a few different roles. So all of our clinical fellows are doctors with experience working in NHS GGC. We work within the Digital Health Validation Lab, which is part of the wider Living Laboratory programme. And the DHVL really works to generate evidence to support new medical devices within the NHS. We work with a variety of innovators, so that might be industry, academics, or people from within the NHS itself. And we work really closely with NHS GGC in terms of conducting research. Finally, I would say that we work very closely with patients who are often involved at the beginning of all of our projects, working in public and patient involvement and engagement, which aims to make research appropriate to the needs and values of the local population. Patients are key stakeholder and often involved at the early stages of concept validation for any new products. And ultimately, everything that we're doing is to try and improve patient care and patient safety. So the job lasts for 1 year. It's split into a number of different components. So point 3, clinical time. And I think within that clinical time, there's actually opportunity to do things that you might not do in a normal training programme. So I've been involved in a lung cancer clinic once a week, getting better outpatient experience than I might have if I was in IMT. Point 1 of the time is spent doing a PG cert in health technology assessment, which really helps to lay the foundations for all the research that we do within the DHVL and all the practical hands-on exposure. And finally, point 6 of the time is spent on academic and innovation projects. And a year seems like a really short time, particularly in medical terms, whenever training programs can last for 6+ years. And I got to thinking, how do you measure what you achieve in a year? And so my year has involved 27 company engagements. I've submitted 1 publication so far. I'm involved in 3 ongoing research projects and 3 separate ongoing systematic reviews. I've been part of a team that's worked on 5 funding applications, and projects that I'm involved in have had £600,000 of funding acquired, which I would say are not too bad.
Very good. Yeah.
So what does evidence generation look like more widely as part of the DHVL? At the very, very early stages, I've already spoken a little bit about PPIE, which is really shaping the design of any research that you might go on to do. Moving forward a little bit, we're often involved in concept validation and in ensuring that we've appropriately engaged stakeholders. So that might be things like focus groups or interviews with clinicians, with patients, and with any other partners that might need to be involved, so NHS decision makers. Moving a little bit further down the evidence generation pathway, so depending on the product, a medical device might need some retrospective technical validation. So for example, if you've got an AI product, you might want to do some data-driven studies. Might look like SIM if you've got more of a hands-on product and you want to see how it's going to work in an NHS environment. Or it might be healthy volunteer studies to gain a bit of a baseline as to how your product works with a variety of people. Moving on a little bit further past that, once you've got functioning prototype, might be getting towards early pilot studies with a very small number of patients, and then rapidly progressing up through to many, many patients, as Sean, I'm sure you're going to talk about in a wee moment. And so what sorts of projects does this actually look like that clinical innovation fellows are involved in? The DHVL has quite a broad portfolio of projects, and the types of devices that we validate are very wide-ranging. Firstly, ACME 70, and apologies for the number of acronyms on this slide as an academic organisation. So ACME 70, on my little postage stamp of what I'm going to say about this, is a project which looks at very high resolution MRI brain imaging and aims to correlate imaging findings associated with good or bad recovery from concussion. And one of the benefits of being involved in a portfolio of projects is that you get exposure to lots of different stages of the research process. Even if it is just a year that you end up staying with the DHVL. So for ACME 70, I was involved in PPIE. Thankfully, there was funding already acquired for this project, but then I was helping with protocol and project document preparation, moving towards ethical submission, and then on to the actual day-to-day running of the study with data collection and study management. And Sean, I think you've got a very interesting experience with Radical.
Yes, no, Radical has taken up the majority of my time here at the Digital Health Validation Lab. For those of you who don't know, it's looking at speeding up the lung cancer pathway, the outpatient lung cancer pathway in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, using chest X-ray algorithms. So an AI, a commercial AI algorithm that can interpret chest X-rays. And what we're trying to do is figure out whether we can bring in an AI-enabled pathway. And what I like about Radical is it's very much changing workflow, implementation, translation of a technology that has been around for a couple of years, but that we needed more prospective and real-world evidence. So briefly, what we're doing here is the top pathway is really what happens most places around the UK, being that if you were to unfortunately get lung cancer, probably your pathway to that diagnosis would be through your GP, who sends you in for a chest X-ray. Now, what we know is that there's quite a long delay. It can be very variable depending on time of year and different hospitals between the chest X-ray being acquired and the chest X-ray being reported. So what we are hoping this algorithm would do would give us a rapid first read of chest X-rays. So the X-ray is taken And then the algorithm scores it for a certain number of features. We hope to find the features that correlate with showing cancer and then allow radiologists to then prioritize their reporting workflow. Because prior to that, what would happen is you'd usually just report based on when the X-ray was taken or any major abnormalities that the radiographer had picked up on. So it's a nice pathway to speed up that reporting workflow. We have now implemented this. We finished our data collection for this in October 2024, and we actually saw about 90,000 chest X-rays go through this whole evaluation. And it's a great example of a broad, holistic evaluation of a technology. We're not simply looking at one outcome or one methodology. We've got our clinical effectiveness evaluation, which is sort of what I've just covered. But we're also looking at how this algorithm performs on a Glasgow context compared to where it was trained, which is on large international data sets. In addition to that, we've got a large team involved in evaluating different components, such as a health economics evaluation, tying in with our health technology assessment, PG Cert topics that we learn. But we've got a few health economists who are modeling this pathway from that perspective. And we've also, similar to the PPIE style work, we've got qualitative interviews who are capturing patient and staff perspectives and understanding how acceptable is it to use a technology like this in our lung cancer pathway. So we're quite mature in this, and this is a good example of a mature company approaching the DHVL with a specific request, which was a large-scale prospective evaluation. And conversations on this started even before my time, so one about 2022, I believe. So it's been a long work in progress, and we've now got all of our data. We're writing up, and we're working on our dissemination activities. It's been exciting to be involved in that, for sure.
Amazing. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a little bit about Soprano ML, which is a project which uses two AI algorithms to find a very rare type of amyloidosis. For this study, it's slightly earlier in the AI validation pathway. So we're going to use retrospective anonymized NHS GGC data to detect known cases in the first instance, which may eventually help us move on to a more prospective study. And so for Soprano ML, as I say, this is a little bit of an earlier project, but it's been really exciting to actually be able to be involved very closely with the design of the study to move it from just an idea into what looks an awful lot more like a research project, from proposal right the way through to ethics submission, which we are just tying off at the moment. And so I think together these projects are a really good example of the different sorts of studies that we do in the DHVL. So an acceptability and feasibility study using 70 MRI brain imaging, to a prospective real-world validation study of an AI chest X-ray algorithm, to one of the more retrospective technical validations of AI algorithms using previously collected anonymized electronic health record data. So what comes next, Sean?
Well, I think one of the nice things about this job is that it's not very restrictive. There's a lot of different routes that you can take after your fellow year. So I first came in with 3 other fellows in the first batch, and we've all done quite different things. I've gone down the research route, so I'm currently midway through an MD that came off the back of the radical study I was just talking about, to build a couple more projects into that MD in the overall theme of artificial intelligence and lung cancer. I want to be an oncologist, so that makes a lot of sense for me. And yeah, this job's been fantastic from my own development, especially from that perspective. 2 of the other fellows had come into the job and wanted to be radiologists and anaesthetists, and have got successful applications on the back of this job. You do get publications in this job. You do get a postgraduate certificate. So these are all points for your applications. You also get that extra clinical experience. Then we've got one of our other fellows called Hartesh, who some of you may know. He was a GP at the time of picking up this job, so a very different experience coming into it. And he has continued to be a GP, but also he's got a couple of other roles. So he's really built out more of developed his career towards strategic innovation roles. So he's a key figure in our evidence generation strategy. He delivers boot camps and hot clinics with innovators and academics. He engages with a lot of startups as well, and he's doing that part-time as well as his GP work, and he's also the primary care innovation lead for the West of Scotland Innovation Hub. So he really is Mr. Triple Helix himself. And as well as that, he supervises our DHVL projects as well. So yeah, just to really say that there is a large variety of experiences that you get through this job. And one of those things is that you get a disproportionate amount of exposure to industry and commercial perspectives, which is hard to come across in our line of work as medical professionals. And also it's pretty hard to come across in academia. There's more of it there, but this job definitely gives you a lot of insight into how the health system functions from another perspective. And I think that's very valuable, and that a lot more people would benefit from having those perspectives. And I think that's us pretty much for our presentation.
Yeah, great. We can move on to some questions. We probably stop sharing the slides if our button
There we go.
appears. Excellent. Great. Thank you very much for that, and for giving kind of an outline of some of the projects that you've been involved in. So I'm going to ask a few questions now that more delve into kind of the less structured, how it, what's it like being a fellow? So first question for you, Dervla. As well as doing these projects, we're, as you know, jumping on calls with innovators to understand what their needs are. So, rather than coming to a fully formed project, a lot of the work as well involves conceptualizing that, and quite with, we've heard examples of the different, on the spectrum of the maturity of the product, from something that's already been received regulatory approval and ready to deploy versus, earlier stage feasibility work. So I think my question to you is really, what's it like working with early stage innovators, and what have you gained from that part of the role?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I find it really exciting working with early stage innovators. I think there's a real opportunity to be creative in what you can offer them, and particularly with a lot of the earlier projects we do, we have a lot more scope in some ways to really develop what our strategy will be, look really carefully at what potential outcomes might be important, and understand really what's important to clinicians, to patients, and to innovators.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of how it translates into my clinical time, it gives me some real joy in clinical practice to think that all the frustrations that we might have in day-to-day clinical care, that there are solutions that are just starting their journey that may well totally change how we operate within the NHS in 10, 15 years' time. So I think in some ways, actually engaging early with these companies really, plays into my clinical time too.
Yeah, fab. Thanks. So for Sean, I don't know if you've had experience of it, but our clinical innovation fellows often have to give a dose of clinical realism to some of the tech hype or optimism that's out there. So I guess question is, have you had that, and if not, then are there other examples you can give where, I guess, as a clinical innovation fellow, you've been able to really influence a project or, the direction of it based on your clinical experience?
Yeah, I definitely think there is. And I think that is probably a fair comment, that a lot of our innovators and people we engage with do have exciting ideas that maybe do fray on the side of being optimistic. And part of our job is to try and take their vision a little bit further and see what sort of challenges it might run into immediately. And I am surprised about how valuable that can be to these guys. I have a number of different examples in my head, but I mean, the general pattern is trying to just give them the on-the-ground feel of what how a clinic works, or how a clinical service works, or how a pathway works. And then the problems do tend to become self-evident. But that isn't to say it's not valuable. It's not just a dragging down to earth thing. These conversations can be incredibly valuable because Absolutely. It can save a lot of time and energy for both sides to sort of redirect subtly as we go.
Yeah, I think just underscoring the value of having you guys is, actually access to those clinical insights can be really hard to get. So whether it's just understanding kind of real pain points, if you can get that concept validation early on, then yeah, before you go and make it the most accurate thing in the world, make sure that it's actually solving a real problem. Mm-hmm. But also, lacking, I think quite a few innovators out there just lack the understanding of clinical pathways, so if innovators are one of their jobs, if they want to get to market and they want to be recommended on NICE guidelines, they need to show what the current standard of care is and how they're proposing that they'll improve things, how they'll disrupt it, and even just that baseline of, okay, what actually happens? Yes, there's guidelines, but like, what are the workflows? What are the step-by-step? So yeah, I think the fact that we have you guys here to provide that within the daily conversations with these innovators, to just in terms of an efficiency perspective from them is super valuable. So thanks, I guess, on behalf of all innovators. So, okay, and then just, these are a few more open questions to both of you. Again, just a reminder to folk to please do pop any questions you have for Dervla and Sean, or me, but most of these guys, in the Q&A function, then that would be appreciated, and then we can cover those. So if you think of innovation before and after your time in the fellowship, how do you feel that it's sort of changed your conceptualization, if at all? That's a leading question, on innovation within your clinical career.
Yeah, interestingly, in a couple of different ways. So I think when one of the common feelings is frustration at the lack of innovation that you see around you. And actually, I think I've got a bit of a more understanding perspective, because it's really hard. It's really hard to get these things all the way into practice. And so you have a little bit more of an acceptance and understanding of why maybe things aren't as shiny and innovated and modern as you would like them to be, because you recognize the different responsibilities, the different steps, and the different fall-off points along innovators' journey. And the flip side of that is you see stuff that has been innovated well, and you think, wow, you actually did that. That's really cool. Well done. And it gives you this, you don't take that for granted at all anymore when you see things that have clearly had a lot of thought put into them. So I guess a more mature and patient perspective on innovation, how you would summarize that.
Anything to add?
I think similarly, I think whenever we think of innovation, a lot of the time we think of this really bright, shiny new product, which is, going to solve the entirety of a problem. And I think for me, looking at innovation in health technology, often it can be the really humdrum organizational picture of a product that works really well behind the scenes, and it's not curing cancer, but it is doing something really basic really well. That actually what good innovation sometimes looks like is something that people wouldn't necessarily feel will take the spotlight.
Kind of seamless.
Exactly. So I think sometimes the organizational innovation of something that streamlines a pathway is actually incredibly important and incredibly valuable in terms of time and resource efficiency.
Yeah, these are things that you'll notice now. Great. Okay, so we've talked to we mentioned there, and kind of the value of SIFs, I guess, to innovators, having that access to your experience and expertise. And is there anything else that you think, if we think of in the title of this webinar around building capacity for clinical innovation, what do you think that clinicians can kind of bring to the table when working in this space?
Yeah, so I think it's, we've touched on this, but that real sense of what is important. And I think sometimes we can think laterally with our clinical experience to see something that isn't necessarily immediately obvious that might actually be really important to, for example, the health economics of a new product.
Yes, yeah.
And, you know, Sean, you've touched on really grounding innovators in a sense of what the clinical pathway looks like, a practical sense of how things work, and really analysing products with that in mind. Sean, I don't know.
Yeah, pretty much the same. I think our pathways, we know when you go into a new department in medicine or even any organisation, you are sort of overwhelmed with the number of different pathways and the way things work. And health is, I feel, even above average on that sort of scale of pathway. And they can be very opaque to people outside of the system.
Yeah.
As we said, these guys coming in with these ideas usually have a very different skill set, a very different background to us. And sometimes pathways that we work with look illogical from the outside. There's usually a reason that they're a little bit windy. And I guess what we're doing is trying to explain those reasons and try and figure out whether there is a place for their product or their thoughts or their ideas in there. Yeah, so really just building on what Dervla said, I think it's one of the things we found with Radical was there's a huge pathway to implement, and there's a lot of different people involved in that pathway. There's a lot of different workflows, and then you're really getting into human level personalities and whether they're interested in what you're doing as to how your innovation can pan out. Trying to explain that to someone who just wants a nice clean solution, just wants to plug in, and that it's rarely that simple, very rarely that simple.
Yeah,
I think is good recurrent theme.
Yeah, what you guys can bring. Okay, so slightly formally, I think just taking a step back, thinking over the past year, I'm interested in kind of your real perspectives on what it's like being involved in the DHVL. But I guess with the angle of what advice would you give to people coming into this role once they've just on day one, they've landed, what can they expect? What surprised you? What advice would you give?
So yeah, I think I would compare starting in this role to very much to comparing starting being a doctor.
Okay, cool.
There's a lot of different moving components that you never realised were there. And it can feel quite uncomfortable at the beginning to enter such a new world with its own language, its own acronyms, its own, problems. And I think my advice would be is to really just embrace that and embrace the fact that it can feel uncomfortable being in such a new environment, but knowing that, you will bring value. And I think one of the things that really surprised me was how many different components are to research. I think we all have this perspective of, oh, research is the bit where there's a patient in front of you and you're doing a study and it's all going well.
Yeah.
And actually, I think research is so much more than that. And I think as a team, we really bring that together. Research is getting funding, it's writing proposals, it's thinking about what a product needs, what an innovator needs, and it's thinking about how to move things forward and how to manage the day-to-day running of progressing a project inch by inch. And
that's very true.
I think it's just that understanding of actually it is not just day one you're in A&E, you've got patients and they're going to be in your study, but that it's a real process, and engaging with that and just doing your best to work within that, I think, is my best advice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm always struck kind of so as part of our setup at the DHVL, obviously we've got a portfolio of projects. Our clinical innovation fellows are involved in a few. And I think in terms of that other side of research, within these meetings, we'll be reporting, each project will have a lead, which is often yourselves, and you'll be reporting on the progress on it, what are the blockers. It's just a very real, almost kind of project management angle that you then kind of reporting and letting the team become aware, and then sort of collaborating to mitigate risks and things. But yeah, certainly moving over from academic kind of research through to I guess, more managerial stuff. I've been dealing with contracts and finances and all the back end fun stuff. You get a bit of exposure to that as well with, so for for SIFs, part of it is helping think about what a project needs and then thinking about, okay, what do we actually need to cost in this? So you can get a real flavor of like, what is it that costs so much in a clinical trial? Like, why are they so expensive?
Absolutely.
And now we can see a costing sheet right in front of us. So I think it was a bit of realism as to, so yeah, here's your Siri pitching in there.
Yeah.
Sean, I guess similar question. So folk that are, have maybe applied for this role or thinking about applying in future, what advice would you give in terms of the flavour of DHVL, what to expect, what surprised you?
Yeah, I think coming with a well, for a start, it's really different to clinical work in a very refreshing way. It's a step sort of onto a different treadmill, if you like. But there's only a few times in a normal medical career where you can jump out and explore something, and also not be too senior to ask stupid questions. So we can just come in here and be like, what on earth is going on? Totally new.
Yeah.
But also the other side of that is that I think don't underestimate how useful all the knowledge that you've built in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or whatever you've been doing in clinical space. You can't understate how useful that experience actually is. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way because you're used to being the more junior person on a medical team in a ward that you're not that familiar with. But when you take all that experience that you've had and you bring it into a different environment, it's very valuable, and it's a good feeling, and you can help people in ways that you haven't before.
Yeah, and again, to second that, not only sort of explaining things to innovators, but even others in the DHVL team. So I certainly do not have a medical background, and obviously we all work together, and part of that is in the sort of operations, and sometimes the value is like explaining to us, for the non-medics in the room is a common phrase I hear from you guys, and it actually just explaining things in a way that then allows us to work more effectively. So there really is, I guess more selfishly, a lot of benefit to having you guys around.
I would just say that's mirrored on the clinical side, that we've all, I think, in many ways, a great team is having lots of people who have their own expertise rather than everyone who's kind of a generalist in everything. And that actually, the non-clinical insights of how research actually works in practice, and the people who get grant applications going, and all the other tiny, or not even tiny, but all the other constituent bits of getting research going, that is such a valuable experience to have, and so valuable for us to learn from as well. Just, I wouldn't say it's one directional, I would say
thanks
very awesome.
No, definitely. I think because I think as well you get kind of exposure to, so we other folk in the team that we have is, so there's myself, portfolio manager, we've got our clinical study and data coordinator, we've got our business development manager, there's marketing, there's a lot of the different experience and expertise that can kind of come together and make something great. Okay, I think we'll now move to, we've had some questions come through, unless there are any closing thoughts. Well, how about we leave the closing thoughts to the end, Claire? That would make sense. Okay, so we've had a few anonymous questions. Are you ready for these? They'll be on the fly. Have you been able to get involved in other things that the Living Lab is involved in, like public engagement and STEM activities? So have you been able to get involved in other things the Living Lab is involved in, like public engagement and STEM activities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have been involved. So was previously involved in open days, either for high school students or students who are on a foundational degree, running sim sessions in the sim lab in the Queen Elizabeth as part of the wider Living Lab kind of activities. Which is a really fun session, and it's really nice for us to be able to showcase a little bit of what we do, both as doctors and as researchers, and to have the opportunity to engage with the local community in doing so. And to be honest, just had great fun.
And other sort of parallel strands of research, like ethics committees and board meetings with big companies and stuff like that. You can be sort of fly on the wall for those sorts of things. But no, exactly what Dervla was saying about public engagement as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Here's a nice question. What have you enjoyed most about the role?
I've enjoyed most just the variety and some of the just learning about how people think about health. I have special interest in artificial intelligence, so that has just been infinite opportunities to learn more about that and speak to AI researchers and AI developers and CEOs and understand a little bit about where they feel it's going, and then trying to imagine what the health system would look like if that was happening. So I find that a lot of fun, just meeting different people who have sometimes wacky ideas about what health should be, but you know, it could be.
Absolutely. I agree. I really enjoy the diversity of projects that we work with. I think there's never a dull day. Always kind of striking up interesting conversations. I think the team that we work within is incredibly supportive, and everyone's made a huge effort to help me get up to speed whenever I started and to help me in everything that I'm trying to do. So I think it's been a really lovely teamwork environment. And I think talking to industry and engaging in industry projects, I personally find quite exciting. I really enjoy, moving a project forward and, trying to get funding or trying to get a project off the ground. So yeah, they're my top three, I would say.
Nice. So that's the fun side. I think someone's asked what has been the biggest surprise to you when working in this space. So I know that we've spoken a bit about, what advice you would give or what surprised you, but if there was one thing, and it doesn't have to necessarily be positive, like what was the biggest surprise to you when, I guess, starting or working in this space over the past year? And what were you not expecting?
Yeah, I'll go with a slight negative. Leaving Dervla with the nice comments. I think the biggest ongoing surprise for me is the translational gap between what we read we have a journal club, and what the sort of technology that we come across in academic papers, journals, and that you might see on LinkedIn, and just the huge gap between that being proven in a silico environment or in some research lab in Silicon Valley, and the difference between where the clinical reality is currently at, which might sound like a bit of a sales pitch for the Digital Health Validation Lab, but no, there is just so much translational work that is required to start closing that gap, which is daunting, but also, I guess, inspiring, and it gives us a big drive to continue what we're doing. But I do find that constantly surprising.
Yeah. Yeah, leaky pipeline of stuff that has got a lot of potential to actually get and pushed into practice. Dervla?
I think on a wider systems level, I think the volume of innovation that is happening is really surprising in some ways. Very positively that there are so many people out there thinking about how to make things better. But I suppose slightly echoing what you've said, Sean, that the NHS doesn't always feel very innovative whenever you're working within it. And so I think taking that step back and understanding the wider industry that is supporting healthcare, I find that very interesting. And I suppose hand in hand with that this is the first time that I've worked in an office environment since I've graduated. I think you have perceptions of what that might be like, and I think the reality is that in comparison to medicine, where there's a very clear end of the day that you hand over, that you're not responsible for whatever happens after you've left the building.
Yeah.
That on the flip side, it's been really interesting and needed a little bit of adaptation to manage projects over from start to finish over a really long time, and having that kind of constant sense of that you're still trying and you're still trying to push it. So I would say it's a very different way of working, coming from a medical environment to more of a kind of industry academic type of role. which I wasn't necessarily expecting.
Yeah. No, for reference for everyone online, we have like a kind of an open office with lots of different desks and things, and something that's exciting, although you guys might not necessarily experience it. We're moving into the Health Innovation Hub, which is, we'll be getting a new building. So we're currently based, it'll still be on the Queen Elizabeth campus, but we're going to get, we've got, as part of the Living Lab, and I know that was a question earlier, part of the funding of that was to build a new building. And so as well as the DHVL, we'll have like the ground floor. It's going to be residence for like with labs for SMEs and innovators that are locally and want to be based there. So I think the office space there will also be interesting. Just maybe think of that. And that's got our new simulation suite in it. So we'll be, it can be configured to be like a hospital setting, GP practice, consumer, whatever. We'll put in some couches and make it a home. So I think that's also probably quite exciting in terms of the environment being quite different. Okay, a few other similar questions around really your experience. So the main thing that you'll take from this role into your career going forwards, you spoke about the different, I guess, pathways that people even within your cohort have gone on. And what's the main thing that you will take? I guess, Sean, do you want to answer that?
Main thing I'll take, I think, is a much greater understanding of industry and what industry you're trying to do. I think a lot of medics would be guilty of assuming the industry is always up to something a little bit, cheeky. Yeah, I think that's an unhelpful general consensus. With drug companies, it's a classic, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think you get a much more nuanced understanding of that, about why funding structures exist the way they do. And another thing I think is being able to look at a problem from a health tech perspective that an organization might be going through, be it in a training program at an admin level or a systems level, and sort of having a bit of a head start on being able to figure out what might and what might not work there and what problem might be fixable. I guess that might not be that obvious to a lot of people if the problem is fixable or not. That's why health consultancy exists. Because it's not an obvious problem. So I guess that's really helpful. I think I've said already I want to do oncology, and that's quite a big thing in oncology. There's a lot of cutting edge research, and there's usually funding available to optimize, and there's a lot of data flying around. So there's lots of big data projects. So yeah, that's going to be really useful for me, and I would consider it a bit of a head start on maybe some of my peers who won't have had such a strong experience with that.
Makes sense. Okay, next is a nice question. What have you been proudest of the most through your time at DHVL? So Dervla, we also saw your very impressive list. What gives you that sense of pride, I feel like, in what you've managed to achieve? And I will be coming to you next.
I think the thing that makes me proudest is probably the projects where I've been most involved in pushing them through to get to a point. So I think Soprano ML, which I spoke about a little bit during the presentation, I feel very strongly about that, irrespective of what results we get, that I'm proud of kind of how I've dug into a subject topic that I didn't know anything about. And I think most clinicians could probably say that about transthyretin amyloidosis. And also that it really helped to develop my skills in thinking about what AI products might need to be validated throughout the pipeline. So I think that was a really practical example of something which really developed my own knowledge and skills, but by generating a proposal and getting stuck in. So I think, I think that overarching sense of driving things forward and adapting to whatever problems might pop up in the research pathway. I think I'm proud of that.
Should be. Sean?
Yeah, I think pretty much the same, to be honest. I think what's on the other side of that steep learning curve when you first come in, where everything feels like, oh my goodness, I'm never going to be able to drive this forward. And then you find yourself sort of 6 months later, like actually being quite central to something that's happening that's, got a lot of people involved, and your opinions are valued, and the work you produce is going to be the results and the reports and stuff. That is rewarding.
Yeah, work to be proud of. Awesome. Okay, we're coming to the end. We've got 2 more questions, but if there are any others, please do pop them in the chat, because we may have time for more. So Laurie from Codebase has said, love the insights. Thanks so much for sharing. Do you have any advice to founders who don't have a clinical background? So that's for founders that don't have a clinical background, who have an idea for a medtech product.
Come chat to us.
Yeah, easy one. Thanks for the setup.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really, understanding early on that you will need engagement from a wide variety of stakeholders, from a wide variety of people, and that there will be practical issues that you won't have foreseen, and perhaps that we don't even foresee. And I think having that real understanding of the evidence generation pathway, that no single project is going to totally validate what you're trying to achieve, that it's a long process, and that the earlier you start engaging with other people who can help, probably better. Yep.
Anything to add, John?
No, that was perfect.
Yeah. What she said. I think as well, I think one of the things when we're on calls with founders is, although you might not have a medtech background, you probably have an idea of the kinds of claims that you want your product to be able to make. So I think part of your role and our role is helping sort of elicit that from, working with innovators to really think about what the end goal would be. Like, you want to be able to stand up in 5 years and say, it does this thing and it does it well, and actually working out what those outcomes are with innovators can be useful, but also something that innovators themselves can bring to the table is that what claims do they want to make? They might have already spoken with regulators, before they come to us, and knowing some of the evidence that's required, or they might not, and it might be just like fresh start. I want to do some evidence. Okay, and this is from Robin. So, hey guys, do you feel the knowledge you have gained in research processes as a CIF has changed the way you think about and practice clinical medicine on wards and in clinics? So this is more the angle of like the research side. What does research bring to clinic?
I would say that being involved in a variety of research projects definitely increases your subject knowledge. I think surprisingly, there are bits and pieces that through doing research projects, I have then been much more informed about medically. We're all still on a training pathway, that having the opportunity to really explore a subject with the lens of doing research can in turn impact on your clinical practice in that area and make it better. I would say that research processes are quite different to clinical pathways. Research processes are often much more well thought out, much more rigorous in some ways in terms of documentation. And I think there is something maybe that we should learn from that as doctors, that actually if we're going to document all of these things for a study, then maybe we should be documenting them for everyone who comes through the door.
Yeah, if we can make it efficient and not too burdensome for people to do so. But that's where you need the innovation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Devices will help.
Yeah, solve all our problems. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I guess I have just a few thoughts. So just because you've mentioned, Sean, you mentioned journal clubs, and thinking of what your, if a clinical fellow comes to be with us for the year, what that might look like. Dervla, you obviously broke it down in terms of the time spent at the DHVL versus clinic, but in terms of the wraparound that DHVL provides, part of it is that sense of cohort. So that will vary in the numbers of folk who are specifically funded through this clinical innovation fellowship versus others that were brought together. But Sean, do you want to say a bit about the journal club?
Yeah, so I run a journal club on a Tuesday morning. I think my boss said it's the biggest journal club in the University of Glasgow, which is good. But I get similar to all of our experiences through this job have been very different. Not everybody wants to do oncology. So you learn a lot about your project. And then you also inevitably end up presenting journals that are specific to your interests. That is a fantastic way of keeping up to date with all innovation across a broad space. We do focus on digital health, but methodologies are similar. And I think a lot of the learnings and a lot of the criticisms and praise that we give these papers are similar and touch on some of the things we've discussed here. But yeah, so hopefully that will be going next year. I'm not sure if Dervla's going to take over the reins or not. It's my baby, so maybe I'll trust her with it. But yeah, so if you're going to come on board and, or if you're just interested and you liked what we've been talking about today, then we may be able to get you involved.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's part of the different levels of, like, if you're learning from innovators and people, but also that peer-to-peer learning and that opportunity, I guess, to learn from each other's specialisms and what's everyone's interests are, and critiquing the papers, that academic skill set as well, just helping to nourish that. Okay, any closing thoughts now? Now that we're at the end, we've got 5 minutes or so. We might close a bit early, but I guess, you know, from my perspective, I think you're so valuable, I guess, to the team. This type of role, I think, is valuable to, as I say, as we've talked about, that kind of access to clinicians and getting that insight that's quite rare to be able to access otherwise, and that sort of structured way that we provide. I think what I've also heard today is the amount of influence that you guys can have as a, particularly, you know, if you get stuck into a project, so there's, you know, being able to change the direction based on your clinical insights. There's the variety of stuff that you can get involved in. So I think this is a great program. But yeah, any closing thoughts from yourselves on your experience or what you want to tell our online attendees?
I mean, I would thoroughly recommend this job to anyone, and have done. I think that it's so much more than just, you know, the split of your time. We're involved in a team. The supervision that we get is astronomical, both clinically and academically, and I've been very fortunate in having, you know, that real sense of a network of people who are helping you and driving you forward. And yeah, I think it's totally changed my concept of what my future career will look like. I'm applying for an MD at the moment, and I really would hate to lose this kind of experience, and for my future job to not continue to include an element of this in whatever form that looks like. So yeah, thoroughly recommend.
Yeah, me too. And I guess we're really lucky to have this here in Glasgow. It's not a given that there are jobs and organisations like this where we want them to be.
Yeah.
And I think having something like this up in Scotland, Glasgow even better, is fantastic. And I'm very grateful to those higher ups who have enabled this programme and continue to fund it. And I hope you realise what a good thing you're doing.
Thank you, Kira. Excellent. Okay, well, I think we'll close there. Thank you very much for coming. And yeah, again, if there are any kind of questions that you have, we've got our DHVL inquiries mailbox. If you look on our website. But yeah, always happy to hear from clinical academics, innovators, clinicians about any projects within the validation space that you're working on and would like to collaborate on. Thanks very much, and I'll speak to you later.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.